Hello, it's Mr. Ferreri here, and I'm going to be talking to you through the final theory of a romantic relationship, and this is Duck's phase model of relationship breakdown. Now, most of the theories beforehand have sort of explained kind of maybe why you might remain within a relationship, could understand why a relationship break down. And Duck kind of is a bit of a misnomer in terms of kind of relationship breakdown. It doesn't explain the breakdown, it explains kind of what happens in a breakdown. If you want to turn to equity theory, you can perhaps understand why a relationship could come to an end in terms of dissatisfaction and people potentially kind of not being kind of happy with the lack of kind of fairness within a relationship. Though it is kind of a model that has been around for a long time and definitely worth having a look at. Only thing I would say in terms of phases, there's a chance that this is slightly different to a stage model. Phases implies that you can potentially be in kind of more than one phase at a time. The only thing we talk about is the threshold to go from one phase to the other. And we see that he proposed this particular model based on this idea that it takes time to kind of understand how a relationship comes to an end, and it goes through these particular phases that we're going to have a look at. Now, we don't kind of start with the relationship kind of being in perfect condition, that everything's kind of working out fine. We see that the relationship is beginning to kind of break down. You know, this could be down to dissatisfaction, could be down to kind of other things. So we do have a threshold here that talks about this is enough, I can't take it anymore. So threshold is just as we talk about in terms of a house, in terms of a doorway, kind of going from one kind of room to another. There's a threshold. Kind of once you cross into it, you kind of enter that kind of phase one. So as soon as I can't take the dissatisfaction anymore, I'm entering into Duck's kind of model for a relationship breakdown. And we see that roughly speaking, there's kind of four phases that kind of move kind of down into kind of the final one, which is grave dressing. I suppose you could say you can move back up to the other phases. Each of the phases has a threshold, and then ultimately, you know, we kind of work our way through this. And I'm going to take you through each one of these things individually. So the intrapsychic obviously is about inside the head, you know, kind of the things that I'm thinking. Of course, I've been unhappy in terms of kind of maybe the fairness of things, and so it could be characterized by social withdrawal, because I need that time to kind of talk, to kind of maybe be resentful and kind of lament kind of how things are. Of course, it does imply that this is by yourself, but I don't think it has to be. Intrapsychic just means it's within my head, but potentially as I'm processing things, I may actually talk to somebody else, because ultimately what I want to do is evaluate the relationship, and I basically want to get to the point where I have this threshold that says I'd be justified in withdrawing. I kind of need to get to that particular point before I move into the next kind of phase, for me to kind of go, okay, so this is not just me, I ultimately need to figure this one out. And then I move into dyadic. Dyadic means two, so this is the first time really that the couple themselves start talking about potential breakdown. That is, it says the couple start to talk. And of course, what they need to talk about is the inequalities. Not going to talk about the kind of how brilliant things are, though of course there is a chance for reconciliation. So I do like Duck's model because it does allow us to potentially to have that reconciliation, and especially, it says here, especially if there's a focus on problem solving rather than destructive blaming. And I certainly in lessons kind of spoke about kind of how potentially a focus on feelings becomes a lot more kind of positive than destructive blaming. So when you do this, or this is how I feel when this happens, is a kind of lot more positive way of dealing with things, rather than kind of you miserable cow, you should never have done that kind of idea. But of course the dyadic phase does have a few other elements to this. Of course, if you are going to try and change, you might make some promises to make things work. But of course, at the same time, you could actually figure out kind of why things won't change. Okay, and of course, what this means is that the relationship will not work, and so therefore the threshold here is I mean it that we can't be together. And ultimately then we have to move to the social phase. Social is just that it is about talking to other people involved in terms of you tell people, and of course alliances can be created at this particular point, because ultimately you are looking for advice and support from people outside your relationship, and potentially telling the children and telling people kind of what's going to happen. So, of course, it's quite likely that if you have alliance, that some people might take your side, and of course, they might be keen to help you in that denigration. So, denigration is just literally saying, putting them down. That person is no good, never liked them, all that type of idea. But there's also this business of scapegoating, that it was never nothing you did; it was all his fault. That type of idea. But of course, be careful here, because if a couple does reconcile, you don't want to be the friend that says, "Yep, that was a complete loser," because that could be a little bit awkward. So we do get to the point in this one where potentially you need to look at implications. So you need to decide kind of who's going to do what and where, and what's going to happen to the house, the kids, the dog, all those sub things. And of course, once you start working out those social implications, it does become quite clear that the end of the relationship is now inevitable. So at this particular point, there's there's still an element of reconciliation possible, but it's becoming inevitable. At least once you cross that threshold, we find that it is over. Now, it could be that you spend a lot of time in this particular kind of phase. It's called the grave dressing phase, not because it's trying to be morbid or trying to kind of remind you of kind of terrible things, but it is kind of this idea of you trying to understand kind of why the relationship died. And it's a bit like an inscription on a tombstone, kind of talking about kind of the reasons why a relationship may or may have existed. And this is also quite clear, because you do need to organize your post-relationship lives during this particular stage, because you may want to enter into a new relationship. You might need to be telling kind of more than just family and friends kind of why you've broken up. And I suppose you want to be clear with this. So it does say that you could have different stories. You might not want to focus too much on how great the sex was if you're talking about a new partner. You also don't want to necessarily be too positive, because then it's kind of, well, why did the relationship come to an end? You potentially don't want to be too negative, because then it's kind of like, okay, so why were you with her in the first place, or him in the first place? So it's likely that he may well tell your mother one thing and your mate another. And so this is ultimately seen as being really, really important and quite positive, because ultimately when we get to the end of this, the threshold we basically cross is it's time to get a new life. In other words, you put the dead relationship aside and you potentially move on to a new relationship. So it's very kind of like straightforward in terms of kind of explaining the different things that happens within relationship breakdown. It doesn't explain, as I said, why the relationship breaks down. So we see with some of the evaluation points, we kind of get to that particular point. First things first, it's actually also very practical. I quite like it. But we see Tashiro and Fraser finding that undergraduates basically do talk about the different kind of aspects of Duck's model. They said here they typically reported that they had not only experienced emotional distress, but also personal growth. So if you went kind of through the 4 phases, you ultimately get to as I said, to the end, where you kind of put aside your old relationship and move on to the next one. Segrin basically said if you're unhappy in relationships, you tend to withdraw. So kind of confirming what kind of happens in that intrapsychic phase. And we also say that the grave dressing phase seems to be quite a kind of positive thing, and it kind of helps you kind of understand real life relationships. So there's quite a lot of positive you can potentially take from that. We also find that it does not explain what leads to the initial stages of the breakdown. So it may well be kind of practical, but in some ways it's really just not kind of doing what it's supposed to do in terms of relationship breakdown. But it does have real life applications. Certainly as a counsellor, you can talk to people about the different phases that they may be in. So you could use this in terms of an intervention to identify the phase that people are. Now, of course, it could be that people are at different phases within the relationship. Certainly, if somebody's been thinking about relationship breakdown for a long time, they may well have processed things for a lot longer. And certainly when they get told that the relationship is coming to the end, it may kind of be a bit of a surprise to them. So it is interesting that we can use this in this particular stage. It says that the couples in the intrapsychic phase should be encouraged to think about the positives rather than the negatives. So in other words, we can actually try and get people to potentially kind of change the outcome. And it says here, if the relationship was possible to re-establish liking or re-evaluate the behavior, there could be reconciliation. So, as I said, this is something which couples counsellors potentially could use, could apply it to the couple and certainly help them. So it's very positive in terms of what the model can use. It also says if we can recognize the different stages, we can facilitate them, potentially either patching a relationship or certainly help them understand the stage that they're going through. So certainly if, as I said, if one partner is still at the intrapsychic phase compared to the other person who's kind of telling their mates and friends and things like that, it may well actually kind of show that there's a big difference there, and you can certainly work with those differences. But the biggest weakness potentially is that it's not sensitive to the role that you play, because it's not really appreciating kind of why the relationship particularly breaks down. And we see from Kurtz that this is kind of stating the most obvious thing here, said that the role the person plays in the decision will pretty much be the strongest indicator of the impact. So in other words, if you are the person doing the breaking up or the person being broken up with, that particular impact is going to be depending on the situation. So you could be miserable, for example, if you had the relationship ended with, or you could feel guilty because of it, you know, and of course that could mean that there are some kind of fundamental differences there. But of course, this model is quite interesting. We find that Raleigh and Duck actually added a fifth stage to the particular model and spoke about how we can apply this to the future, that ultimately we can learn from every particular experience, and that could be quite helpful. And they spoke about the resurrection process of how you kind of start that new life, and that could be really positive psychologically. But there could be a gender difference when it comes to this. I don't go through too many issues and debates in this, but obviously there could be a gender bias. We know that in terms of gender differences, that it is possible that women perhaps stress things differently to men. We see that this particular research says women stress unhappiness and incompatibility more so than men, and men talk about sexual withholding. That could well be a biological thing, could well be a evolutionary thing. Certainly this could link to this particular thing where women had the desire to stay friends, partly because of the whole resources business in terms of caring for children. But of course, at the same time, you know, this is quite dated. It could be that things have changed quite dramatically, that maybe men and women are acting a lot more similar because of that. So just kind of process those evaluation points. I think it's a kind of nice theory to write about. Certainly there's a lot of points that we can evaluate, and this is not an essay type question, but certainly we see quite nicely kind of explains kind of the story between Barbara and Jemima, and then it says, looking at those particular comments, outline 2 phases of relationship breakdown. So you need to clearly identify them. And some people, I remember kind of marking this in an exam, kind of thought, well, if Barbara's talking to somebody, it has to be social. But it can't be. It says here, I'm really fed up and I wish the relationship was over, but I can't tell him because he thinks everything is fine. So clearly, by talking to a friend and kind of thinking that she wishes the relationship was over, she's in the intrapsychic phase. She's still thinking about she's kind of, you know, bemoaning the fact that, or lamenting the fact that, you know, her relationship isn't great. Jemima kind of goes on to say, well, we're getting through things slowly. We've told the children, mum is upset, friends take sides, of course. So clearly this can't be grave dressing because they haven't kind of moved on. Certainly can't be dyadic because they've spoken to each other, but they've also spoken to other people. So this has to be social. And so you can see kind of in its simplicity that the duck model is actually fairly straightforward, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. Now that's it for the theories of relationships, and I will continue this video series for you potentially to look at in future. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.